Hello everyone. Hello, good evening everybody. It's great to see so many of you here. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Richard Screeton. I'm head of the Alumni Relations Office here at the University of Manchester, and thank you all very much for coming along to attend tonight's Cockcroft Rutherford lecture. And a very warm welcome as well to those of you who are joining us from home and watching the lecture online. I'm going to start with a couple of housekeeping announcements. We're not expecting a fire alarm test this evening, so if an alarm does sound, please follow the directions of our events colleagues to the nearest fire exit and congregate outside the main entrance of the building where you'll receive further instructions. Please can you also turn your phones to silent. So my colleagues and I have the great pleasure of looking after our relationship with our students once they graduate from the university. And I'm really grateful to those of you who continue to support the university after you've left us, whether it's through attending events like tonight's lectures, whether it's helping our students to make the first steps in their career once they've graduated, whether it's supporting the university through your donations, or whether it's just telling your friends, your networks about the great work that the university does. It all makes a real difference, so thank you very much for your support. So now, I have the great pleasure of introducing the President and Vice-Chancellor of the university, Professor Dame Nancy Rothwell.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Alumni, donors, friends of the university, staff, students, to the annual Cockcroft Rutherford Lecture, our flagship event for alumni. And we're delighted that so many of you are here tonight, and I understand many more watching online at home. This event honours Sir John Cockcroft, alumnus, and Lord Ernest Rutherford, former staff member, for their outstanding and Nobel Prize-winning achievements, which were during their time here at Manchester. They're both a very important part of the rich heritage of the University of Manchester, and we will be particularly celebrating them next year in our bicentenary year, because next year, of course, we will be 200 years old. We're particularly happy that members of the Cockcroft family could be with us here today, and I understand a number of other members of your family will be watching online from different parts of the UK. Our speaker tonight is Professor Tony Redmond, Professor Emeritus of International Emergency Medicine at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute here at the University of Manchester, and immediate past president of the World Association for Disaster and Emergency Medicine. Indeed, I've known Tony for quite a number of years now. Tony qualified in medicine from the University of Manchester in 1975 and specialised in emergency medicine. His special interest in pre-hospital care and the care of the severely injured led him to respond to major disasters, both in the UK and overseas. And in 1995, he founded UK Med, an international NGO that provides emergency medical humanitarian assistance, which you will have seen inevitably on news channels. In 2008, he co-founded the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. Tony's been a member of the WHO Emergency Medical Teams Initiative since its inception and is a member of the WHO Global Alliance for the Care of the Injured. Over a lifetime, he's led teams of volunteers to war zones, sudden onset disasters and disease outbreaks around the world. I remember many an occasion when Tony was due to be there and was told, sorry, no, he's gone to Africa at short notice. So we're delighted he is here to speak to us tonight. Just before I hand over to Tony, I want to just highlight a few of the many, many things that have happened in the university over the past year. So our Manchester Museum reopened the doors in February after a £15 million refurbishment. Just in the first week or two, over 50,000 people formed queues down Oxford Road to visit the museum. If you haven't had the opportunity to see the newly refurbished and extended museum, I strongly recommend it, with new additions such as the Li Kai Hung Chinese Culture Gallery, the South Asia Gallery, and the Belonging Gallery, as well as the wonderful Golden Mummies exhibition. It really is worth visiting. Jodrell Bank's spectacular new First Light Pavilion and permanent exhibition gallery, opened in June 2022, has continued to win awards since its launch. The latest was the top honours in the prestigious Civic Trust Awards ceremony in London for the architecture of the building itself. The Raheem Sterling Foundation has just fully funded 7 undergraduate scholarships at the university for Black British students to help us to close the attainment gap between different ethnic groups, to increase social mobility and support equal access to higher education. The Patterson Redevelopment Project, the home of our cancer research, has been handed over and the move of staff back in has begun. It's just 6 years since a fire devastated the Patterson building, with major impacts on so many staff and students, and hence indirectly on patients. Getting to this point is a remarkable achievement by so many people, and the new building is just amazing. One of many spin-out companies from the university, particularly notable in graphene innovation, has formed an international partnership that will spearhead an unprecedented scale-up of graphene-based technologies to make a substantial impact on global CO2 emissions of the order of $1 billion investment. Earlier in the year, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, announced, to our surprise, a new prize for artificial intelligence, named the Manchester Prize. It was named because it was the birthday of the first stored program computer in 1948, the Baby. And the prize of £1 million will be awarded every year to encourage artificial intelligence. So the Manchester Prize is one we need to win. Nazir Afzal, OBE, officially became our new Chancellor last August and has an installation ceremony at Foundation Day in October. Nazir was the Chief Prosecutor for the North West of England, and more recently he was Chief Executive of the country's Police and Crime Commissioners. He's been a very outspoken supporter of women's rights and the rights of other disadvantaged groups. And since he's been with us as Chancellor, he's taken part in many winter graduations and other events. So as I mentioned, in 2024, we'll celebrate our bicentenary. 200 years of inspiring education, amazing discoveries, and social impact. And in fact, several anniversaries will be occurring in that year. Not least, it will be 20 years since the merger of Humist and the Victoria University. We believe that every day the University of Manchester adds value to the lives of people locally, nationally, and internationally, who are touched by our research, teaching and learning, and our social responsibility. And last week we had 2 events to celebrate our volunteers and our Making a Difference Awards, and we heard about some of the incredible activities of our staff, our students, our alumni, and our partners. And indeed, our speaker tonight, Tony, has similarly made a huge difference globally through his career. And so it is with great pleasure that I welcome Emeritus Professor Tony Redmond to deliver the Cockcroft Rutherford Lecture. Tony, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. It's a real honour and a pleasure to be invited to give this Cockcroft Rutherford Lecture for 2023. I want to talk about medical humanitarianism and reflections of what has now actually been my lifetime of working on the front line. It's almost 40 years now since I started working on the front line, both here in Manchester, in emergency departments, with the ambulance service, and then throughout the world in disasters and in conflicts. The organisation that I founded, UK Med, is currently running a big programme in Ukraine, all across Ukraine. And what I thought I'd do in this talk was take the opportunity to tell you what we're doing in Ukraine, give you a flavour of what it's like to be in Ukraine. I was there just before Christmas. and to show you how the programme that we are delivering there has been drawn from the experience of a lifetime of how best to deliver emergency medical aid in what can be some of the most challenging circumstances. The Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, has said this, and I couldn't agree with him more. And it actually describes why I went into emergency medicine. No one should die for the lack of access to emergency care, an essential part of universal health coverage. We have simple, affordable, and proven interventions that save lives. Now, as a medical student here in Manchester, I quickly became familiar with death. I knew that inevitably we all die, people age, they get sick. We can't save everybody. Even as a medical student here, I diagnosed my father's terminal illness, and he was treated on my ward. I came to terms quickly that life comes to an end, but what I couldn't come to terms with was that people could be taken suddenly ill or suddenly injured and die from conditions that we know they could have been saved from had the right treatment been given by the right skilled people at the right time. Cardiac arrest, hemorrhage, choking. I thought that was just so wrong. And so I was inevitably drawn into the specialty of emergency medicine. Now, this is Sir Harry Platt, a famous orthopedic surgeon in Manchester. Just as an aside, he actually came up with the idea of a fracture clinic, treating people with fractures separately, and that was in Ancoats Hospital in Manchester. But in 1962, he produced a report that said what had hitherto been casualty departments staffed by junior doctors, sometimes even medical students, with no consultant supervision, must be replaced by accident and emergency departments, led by consultants and people being specially trained in that specialty. So the name changed to accident and emergency, something that completely bypassed the BBC, I note. I've written many times to the BBC, telling them about the Platt report and everything, and once they did send me a blue beanie hat with casualty on, thinking that would keep me quiet, but it still annoys me. And so Manchester pioneered the development of accident and emergency medicine. One of the first consultants in accident and emergency medicine was Gordon Lang at Salford. And so I did my training at Hope Hospital in Salford Row. And Professor Sir Miles Irving, Professor of Surgery here in Manchester, developed the first two academic posts in A&E. In 1979, I was appointed lecturer in accident and emergency medicine at the University of Manchester. And at the same time, David Yates was appointed senior lecturer in accident and emergency medicine. David subsequently became the first professor of accident and emergency in the UK, and I became the second. Once I became a consultant, though, and I was working in the emergency department, and I felt that we could save people from instantly reversible conditions, it's really satisfying working in emergency departments. But I realized that too many of the patients, by the time they arrived to us, were beyond saving. But they could have been saved if the techniques that we were doing in the emergency department could be taken to them. And so when I was a consultant first in Stockport, I set about putting defibrillators onto the ambulances. Up until then, only trained doctors were allowed to use defibrillators. Even if cardiac ambulances were called out to you, the ambulance had to go to your home first, then they had to get the crew from the medical team from the hospital, and then it was too late. You need to be resuscitated quickly. And so, working with the ambulance crews in Stockport, first of all, there was actually great resistance from the powers that be, who didn't want ambulance crews to be trained in the use of defibrillators because they thought it was too much of a responsibility and only doctors should do it. And they openly said, well, if we train them up, we'll have to pay them more. So a very far-sighted ambulance officer, station officer, Graham Underhill, and I, well, we thought we'll shame them into putting defibrillators on the ambulance service. And so we said, well, the crews can, in their own time, come and be trained in the use of defibrillators in theory. And we would use automatic defibrillators, which were available then. But we had to raise the money for it, and we did. So we raised the money, we got the defibrillators. And more than that, we put a tape recorder on the defibrillators and asked the ambulance crews, after we'd trained them, to describe the cardiac rhythm and what they would do if they were making the decision. And then we sent the tapes and the ECGs to independent cardiologists. And they could show that the ambulance crew, if properly trained, were as good as the automatic defibrillator. And manual defibrillators were about a third, if not a tenth, of the price of these very complicated automatic ones at that time. They're much cheaper now. And so we were able to shame the powers that be into accepting that ambulance crews could use defibrillators. And to their credit, they then grasped the whole concept wholeheartedly. And here in the Northwest, we quickly became the biggest paramedic training program in the UK. But I also realized that there were some instances where we needed to take surgical teams from the hospital to the scene of an accident, if people were trapped in vehicles, if people were trapped underground. But the hospitals then had no legal responsibility for patients until they came through the doors. So we were going to take the help to them. Again, we had to raise the money for it. And so I set up the South Manchester Accident Rescue Team, or SMART. We were going to call it SMART anyway, because it really annoyed people. And so we worked out what would fit with it. And fortunately, we were based in South Manchester, so South Manchester Accident Rescue Team became the name. But we had to raise all the money for it. We got donations, we bought an ambulance. But of course, if you were to respond out of hours and you didn't know when the call was coming in, then you had to be available. You couldn't be on call for anything else. So we asked senior surgeons, anaesthetists, nurses, emergency doctors to be on call in addition to their NHS duties, to raise the money for their own equipment, do the extra on call, and by the way, we won't pay you anything. We were not short of volunteers, and that taught me a big lesson. People will come forward, people are good-hearted, and we got the volunteers. And we then started supporting the ambulance service. I remember every time I drive down Princess Parkway, I remember being there at 2 o'clock in the morning with a head torch on, trying to get somebody off the central reservation whose car had crashed, and the central reservation had gone right through them and they were pinioned on it. It's okay, he was fine. Just a flesh wound. But without SMART, without the team being there, he would have died on the central reservation, pinioned, because he would have bled to death. So we proved our worth again. But then we were tested even further. In 1988, there was a huge earthquake in Armenia, in the then Soviet Union. And we were asked by the British government to take the team as part of the British aid effort to this big earthquake. And this was transformational now for me. I'd never experienced anything like this. I thought I was an experienced emergency consultant. I could cope with whatever was presented to me. But this, to give you some idea, these are coffins, but they've all got bodies in them. This was the scale of what we were dealing with. And then if that wasn't bad enough, I'd only been home a few hours. When I remember the phone call clearly, I picked up the phone at home. This is RAF Edinburgh. A plane has crashed north of Carlisle. We've mobilised helicopters from RAF Anglesey to go to Manchester Airport to pick up you and your team. And I became Site Medical Incident Officer at Lockerbie. And so for 36 hours, I had to identify bodies, recover bodies, identify human remains, support the rescue teams. We even got a psychology team in to help the people in the town. When I got home, I realised now, if I'm honest about it, it's taken me many years to acknowledge it. I had PTSD, I'm pretty sure. I was withdrawn. I apologised to my family. I withdrew from family activities. I was deeply affected. But I came out of it by acknowledging that I had two choices. One, to never do this again, which was a reasonable choice. It was difficult enough being an A&E consultant. Or if I was going to do it, then it had to be my life's work. You couldn't be the intermittent, occasional disaster responder. You needed to be fully trained, fully equipped, and I needed to work with international teams, with the WHO, with the UN. And much to my family's disappointment, I chose the latter. And UK Med came about. We're a charity. It's an international non-government organisation. We have volunteers. We have over 1,000 people on our register. We're never short of people coming forwards. We can send individual experts to disasters overseas. During COVID, we sent experts to over 20 countries in Africa and in Asia to help them prepare and respond to the pandemic, to train them in how to safely don and doff PPE and how to treat patients with COVID, to support their response. We can send whole teams. We've sent full medical teams to West Africa for Ebola, to the DRC to treat Ebola, to Bangladesh for the diphtheria outbreak, to Samoa for a measles outbreak. We can send teams all over the world. We have a team at the moment in Malawi treating a cholera outbreak. And we can send surgical teams. We have sent teams to every major earthquake since Armenia. And we've sent teams to conflicts. And we have surgical teams working in Ukraine now. But as Dame Nancy said, we also here at the university have the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. This came about from a meeting with Professor Muller and Professor Bertrand Tate and myself to bring together the Faculty of Humanities and Medicine so as those who research into the impact of these humanitarian events can work alongside and share experiences with those who respond. And the university hosts UK Med. We are an independent charity, but we're hosted and supported by the university, for which I'm extremely grateful. And we actually sit physically in the same part of the building with HCRI. And members of UK Med, the senior members, hold part-time academic posts with HCRI, so as we can share experience. And this combination is unique, and unique in the world as far as I know. UK Med started recruiting people from across the country rather than just locally when we were asked by the government to support the medical aid program to Sarajevo during the war. And I worked in Sarajevo throughout the war. The government actually paid for me to be released and we could get an extra member of staff. But we learnt there that outside help for those involved in conflicts is better to treat the war wounded and prevent infection than to actually try and deal with the wounded when they are at the time of wounding. Because you have to be there when somebody's shot or the bomb goes off to actually stop immediate life-threatening hemorrhage. And it will be those near to you, usually your fellow soldiers or fellow citizens, they will be the ones who will do that. But if you survive that, then the death toll from wound infection, because war injuries are inevitably infected, the death toll from infection, the death toll from these very complex wounds can be substantial. And also, untreated, poorly treated limb wounds lead to avoidable amputation. And so we worked with the British Association of Plastic Surgeons, and we rotated surgical teams in and out of Sarajevo to support the surgeons who were working there. They had very skilled surgeons, but plastic surgeons are quite a rare commodity. And no country has enough when the demand increases so much. And so we added support to them, treating these war wounds. We built up an enormous experience. And this has enabled us to do the same now in Ukraine, again, working with the British Association of Plastic Surgeons. And we are rotating teams in and out, just as we did in Sarajevo. Which brings me to our work in Ukraine. As I'm sure you are aware, the war began in February 22. It's over a year now. UK Med deployed within weeks. We were there on the front line. There was only, and still is only, UK Med, MSF and the Red Cross who were there at the beginning and are right there at the front line. And I'm very proud of our teams who volunteer and step forward and have put themselves very much in harm's way. But the first lesson I learned over the years, and which we've applied in Ukraine, is that for humanitarian work, in particular medical work, any help is not better than no help. If you're going to do surgery on me, I want you to be a surgeon. But we have evidence of surgery being carried out by non-surgically trained people because they think any help is better than no help. Not if you're going to take my leg off, it's not. I want you to know how to save my leg. So you need to be fully trained, fully qualified. To work with UK Med, you need to have completed all your training. You need to be a specialist. The same for MSF. This is not a place to learn. This is a place for you to put into practice what you've learned. And also, just being a surgeon is not enough if you've not been trained to how to deal with crush injuries in earthquakes or war wounds. So you need to be fully trained, and that's why we work with the British Association of Plastic Surgeons, for example, because these are all highly competent, highly trained surgeons. You must only go if you're asked. We were asked by the Ukrainian government, asked by the World Health Organization to go. If you just turn up, you're not asked, and you go to these disasters, you're an uninvited guest. You quickly become another refugee. And they've got to accommodate you, they've got to house you, they've got to feed you, they've got to water you. This is an unfair burden you are putting on people. So only go if they are asked, and they will find out, A, if they want you, and B, where best you can be put to good use. But you need to be self-sufficient. Our teams are self-sufficient. You need all your own medical equipment. You need all your drug supplies, you need all your food and all your water. Everyone carries a tent in case there's not accommodation. You cannot be a burden on the host authorities because things are bad enough anyway. So we make sure our teams are self-sufficient. But also, we look to practice normal medicine in highly abnormal circumstances. So you have to be authorized to practice. You can't just turn up and start. You wouldn't do that here. If we had a disaster here and the French turned up and says, oh, ici le French. Quel dommage. I did O-level. And it shows. We wouldn't. I mean, it's funny, but why is it any different? If you go to another country and just turn up. You have to be authorized to practice, and you can get authorization to practice in a country if they need you and want you. I was asked by the Chinese government to take a surgical team to the earthquake in Sichuan. I said, yes, I would go. They said, send me your CV. I thought, hang on, you've asked me. But then it's only correct. And very quickly I got a little certificate back saying I was authorized to practice medicine in China for 30 days from the date of this email. But you need to be fully insured, obviously, for your own protection, but you need to have medical indemnity insurance. If we need it here so as our patients can have redress against us, which is only fair, then why should it be different in another country? It's highly unlikely if during a large emergency or a disaster somebody's going to sue you. It's not unheard of, but it's highly unlikely. But we owe it to our patients because we need to be accountable. Why do I say this? Because we've worked hard to address these problems. In 2010, there was the earthquake in Haiti. There was a leading article in the Journal of Pre-Hospital and Disaster Medicine that said the medical response to Haiti was disaster tourism, that it was a medical shame, that people, doctors just turned up uninvited and just invaded. One of the hospitals I worked in Haiti, but we, like the Red Cross and like MSF, obeyed all the rules and worked with the authorities and worked with WHO. But one of the Haitian hospitals I found, the Haitian doctors holed up in a corner of the hospital. The hospital had been completely taken over by foreign doctors who were working without accountability. I responded straight after the earthquake happened, and we had a field hospital there for 3 months. But 3 months after that, Professor Bertrand Tate led a research team from HCRI to interview survivors. You can see the power of having an academic unit sat alongside a deploying unit inside a university. And he and his team interviewed the survivors and found that amputation rates were hugely variable. UK Med, MSF, the Red Cross have an amputation rate in these circumstances about 5%, sometimes 7%, 5 to 7%, because they carry out limb salvage, because they've got experienced surgeons who know how to save limbs. Most of the teams, they didn't carry out limb salvage. Almost half of their operations were amputations. One of the teams, it was 85%. All they were doing basically was amputating limbs. Now, to be fair, we thought, well, maybe they had a good reason. Maybe they were treating a different subset of patients. So let's look at the medical records. They didn't make records. They just flew in, carried out life-changing surgery, and flew out. Well, maybe we can track them down and interview them to find out why they did what they did. The patient said they don't know who they were. They never gave consent. They were foreign. And WHO had no record of them. The Ministry of Health had no record of them. They had no authority to practice medicine there. This paper that we published from HCRI had a big international impact. And it leads me to the second lesson and the improvements that we have made since. Things are so much improved now. The principle that emergency departments are no longer places where those in need of training go to gain experience from those in need of care, which it was when I was a medical student. The most junior was sent down to work in the A&E department. Now are places where those in need of care go to gain from the experience of those already trained. And that's how it should be. And we need to extend this outwards to the management of large-scale international disasters. And so in response to our paper, the WHO set up a meeting of experts, as it was called. I attended, MSF attended, Red Cross, and so on. And it was agreed to form a foreign medical teams working group. And I was elected its first chair. And we came up with the Blue Book, as it's called, which was classification and standards for teams. So you had to classify what your team was, so as countries would know what your capabilities were. You were a type 1, a type 2, a type 3, and there were minimum standards you had to adhere to. This report came out in the July. In the November, I was leading a team to the typhoon in the Philippines, and on arrival in country, and we were getting authorization to practice, they said to me, "Are you aware of the Blue Book?" I think so. "Do you meet the standards?" I said, "I hope so." It had a major impact on improving standards. We also work with the Red Cross to identify and give advice for the management of limb injuries during conflicts and disasters. So huge improvements came. We then did a second edition of the Blue Book to extend its impact. And I edited for WHO a companion red book to sit alongside the Blue Book to give a guidance to medical teams responding to health emergencies in armed conflicts and other hostile environments. So what negative things I witnessed, we address them, and we address them through the support of academia, through the support of the University of Manchester and all that it has offered us. We could address these things, we could publish them, and bring about huge changes. The next big earthquake was in Nepal, and there were no reports of any inappropriate surgery. And with the standards that we had, the Nepalese health authorities sent 3 teams home. They revoked their visas because they claimed to meet the standards and they didn't. So it's transformed international aid. And what was the Foreign Medical Teams Working Group is now an established secretariat at the World Health Organization. I'm part of that, and we now look to support emergency medical teams all over the world in achieving these standards. And I'm pleased to say that UK Med has reached those standards, and we are the only WHO verified team in the UK. And what this has enabled countries to do is that they can know now what they're getting and, importantly, recognize what they don't want. Lesson number 3, this slide, this picture I took when I was in Armenia. And these are Thomas splints rotting at the side of the airport. The Armenians had never heard of Hugh Owen Thomas, the Welsh bone setter, and his marvellous splint for the management of fractured femurs. These are very expensive. They were just dumped on the side of the airport, left to rot in the rain because they were not asked for and they didn't know how to use them. So give what people ask for, otherwise it is a shameful waste of what are good intentions. Don't just give what you have. Be very careful about giving drugs, pharmaceuticals, because there are international laws about moving pharmaceuticals across international borders, and WHO has very strict guidelines about this. And be very careful about donating things, because I've seen too much of this when people, with all the best of intentions, give things, but by the time it gets to the country, unless you can take it personally to where it is needed and has been asked for, it just becomes too much of a shambles with all these donated goods. I know that's harsh and you want to do material things and you wonder where the aid goes, but I can assure you it's usually better to give money than things in general, because you will know much more where the money goes if you give it to a reputable agency, but it can be spent in the country. In Ukraine, the shops are open, the supermarkets are open, the restaurants are open, the clothes shops are open, but they need the money. And so if you can support them, then you can allow people to buy these things in country, and that also supports the local economy. And so the first thing we were asked for in Ukraine was to send our field hospital. We have this big field hospital that has an operating theatre complex, it has its own X-ray, it has wards and so on, because at the beginning of the war, a theatre complex near to the front line was targeted and shelled. And so they asked us for a field hospital, and we took this overland right to the front line. I won't tell you where it is for security reasons, because they keep targeting it. But we dismantled it and put it into its component parts, and it's all underground in this. Well, I won't tell you where it is, but it's all underground, and they shell above it, but it's still functioning and it's still working. In my role as chair of the Board of Trustees of UK Med. And coming to the end of my tenure, I wanted to, in fact was asked by the board, to go and review our programs. We've raised £5 million for the work in Ukraine, and so to go and see where that money is being spent, and to meet with our volunteers and thank them for all that they're doing, and to meet with Ukrainian authorities and to meet with the World Health Organization, who we work very closely with. It's a no-fly zone, so I had to fly into Krakow in Poland, then overland for a few hours into Lviv, where there is this very large emergency hospital. It's a tertiary referral centre. All specialist services for Ukraine were concentrated on this hospital. But now people who come from the east and the injured people coming from the east have to go by train, a 24-hour journey on a hospital train to get to this super specialist treatment in Lviv. But we were asked to carry out plastic and reconstructive surgery there, just as we did in Sarajevo, and that's what we're doing. But lesson 5, disasters have a long tail. The rehabilitation needs are great and long-lasting. Wenchuan earthquake, 2008, my surgical team there was 4 weeks, but I went back with a spinal injury rehabilitation team for all the terrible injuries from the earthquake. We were there to run a 2-year program. So don't forget that. Once it goes off the TV, the rehabilitation needs are still going on. Just as with the arena bombing here, this terrible arena bombing, the impact on the hospitals was great, particularly for the first few days or weeks. But the rehabilitation needs for those poor children would last months and years. And so we are supporting the development of a rehabilitation program in Lviv. Bombing civilians is awful. I've seen too much of this in my life. This is terrible. So we're helping them build a rehabilitation unit and a rehabilitation service, which they call Unbroken. They tell the injured people, you may be injured, but you are unbroken. Just like the country, they say, we may be damaged, but we are unbroken. I think it's a marvelous sentiment. And they gave me a T-shirt, a black T-shirt with Unbroken on it, which I'm very proud of. I make no apologies for this slide. I know it's quite distressing, but I want you to listen to this. I'm breaking no confidences, because this picture is on public display in the hospital in Lviv. This woman is a nurse at the hospital, and her flat was hit by a missile, and she lost her legs. But here she is in the hospital where she worked. She's with a wonderful spirit, and she's being lifted up by her fiancé to get ready to get dressed for her wedding. From Lviv, I went across to Poltava. No fly, had to go by train. The trains. I've seen the movies, I know a little about it. They said, oh no, it'll go without you. So I listened to Radio 4 recently, and there was a Ukrainian refugee, and she was asked what she missed most about Ukraine and what frustrated her most about living in the UK. The trains. 19 hours across, it's okay, you fold the seats down, it's all right. Even an old man like me could manage it. The trains have to go slowly because of the air raids and potential damage to the track. But it brings me to lesson 5. The medical needs after a large-scale disaster and emergency are threefold. Obviously, you treat the direct consequences. We're treating the war injuries, In Turkey now, we are managing the crush injuries from the earthquake. But the damage to the health infrastructure, either by destroying buildings or by killing the healthcare workers or by restricting access, means that coincidental emergencies cannot be treated. It also means that chronic conditions cannot be treated. And unless you address these other two, then the death toll from the coincidental emergencies and chronic conditions will be greater than the direct consequences. You have to have a threefold response to disasters, and you might need to reflect on that when you think about the COVID response. And don't forget obstetric emergencies. In our emergency team, we always have a surgeon who can do a cesarean section, and we have a midwife. MSF, in its latest publication, says that it's the commonest operation it carries out in a war zone is a cesarean section. And so we do primary care clinics. We run mobile clinics in response to requests from the Ukrainian authorities. The mayor of Poltava told me 250,000 people were displaced into his town almost overnight, and they have to have basic medical care. It is difficult working there. There are power cuts all the time, although I like the rather innovative use of Halloween lanterns during the power cut. But our clinics are well received. From Poltava, I then drove down to visit our work in Dnipro, where we're also supporting plastic and reconstructive surgery. This is quite close to the front line, and so they get the immediately injured patients in, get surgery, and then refer them on to Lviv. But we're also giving medical supplies to support the work of the Ukrainian nurses and doctors themselves. We are now a registered charity in Ukraine, so we can employ Ukrainian nurses and doctors. And here the head of the hospital in Dnipro is signing for a consignment of surgical equipment worth over £100,000 that we donated. But it's terribly sad to see hospitals have sandbags up against the windows as they are still targeted. But from Dnipro, I went further north into Kharkiv, and now we're entering into very different territory. Kharkiv has recently been retaken from the Russians, and it's very heavily militarized. I don't have pictures and films of this because I was warned very strictly not to take such pictures, because there are checkpoints, very heavily guarded checkpoints all the way along, and that I might not get time to give my explanation as to why I was taking the pictures, so I took the hint. But I travelled up to Kharkiv and then beyond Kharkiv into Stary Saltiv, which is the most recently reoccupied town. This is right on the border. When I was there, you could hear the shelling from the Russians lobbing it over, and you could feel the air move with the blast as the shells landed. But I was reassured, I think, by the Ukrainian authorities. He said, "Oh, we're far enough away." I hope so. But you could see the effect of war all around. Churches being bombed, the shelling, but most worryingly, the landmines. This took me right back to Sarajevo. So you only drive on the main roads, and you only go on roads which clearly have been used before you. You try and follow another vehicle, but you don't step off the road. They've tried to clear the landmines, but you can never be absolutely sure. But we are running a clinic there right on the front line, and I'm very proud of the people who work there. But as well as treating patients, we're also training people. We were asked by the Ukrainian authorities to train the emergency services in more advanced techniques, the management of mass casualties, the advanced management of injuries, so as even the public could start to deal with injuries during the conflict before the emergency services can get there. So that's what we've been doing. But we've also been doing CBRN, chemical, biological, and radionuclear training. We did this in Syria for the management of chemical weapon injuries. How do you treat a patient while protecting yourself from the effect of chemical injuries? We know how to do it. We had a course that we run for WHO, for Syria and for countries around it. And we were asked by WHO to adapt this for Ukraine, because you just know from the news there is risk of a nuclear reactor going into meltdown. But there's also the underlying threat of a dirty bomb being exploded over the Black Sea, which would have devastating consequences. And so we are carrying out a program on behalf of WHO and the Ukraine authorities to try our best to prepare people for what might be absolutely devastating. And this is what people face. On my first night there, there were 55 missiles went over. They were very good at shooting them down. They were very pleased to put out on the radio they'd shot down 50. I thought, oh, where did the other 5 go? But we were all right. People are very stoic. They get on with their day-to-day life. But what I hadn't appreciated was you blow them up and you can hear them being hit, but the debris comes down. And when I was in Dnipro, there was a young pregnant woman killed by the falling debris hitting her. These have devastating effects, these. This is, again in Dnipro, after an air raid the day before. So I drove around to see the devastation, and you can see the terrible things that these missiles do. Terrible destruction to the building, but what about poor people inside? To send missiles into civilian areas like this is just abominable. They are remarkable in Ukraine. They're keeping everyday life going. There is a curfew from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. in the morning, and it's very strictly, and by very strictly, I mean very strictly enforced, but also they can't serve alcohol before 5. But people do try and keep everyday life going, and the cafes are open. But I was very sad to see this. You see placemats in restaurants here for children for them to crane in. This is what has now become the norm for Ukraine, and I wonder how quickly war has been incorporated into their young lives, and how long and how slowly it will take for it to be removed. Finally, lesson 6 in more general. There are no surprises in the emergencies. I've worked in this a long time. People know what happens. People say, oh, you work in A&E, you never know what's coming through the door. I'll take bets. There are no surprises. Unscheduled, yes. Unexpected, no. There are no accidents. There are no natural disasters. It's all predictable. Things are rarely inevitable, almost always preventable and or mitigated. So we must prepare, practice, and have a plan. BMJ has in fact banned the word accidents because they're not all unpredictable. It's an excuse if you call it an accident. There's nothing could be done about it. Yes, it could. We did practice for the pandemic, and we ignored its findings. There are no natural disasters. You might think, well, actually, no, there are natural phenomena, earthquakes, tsunamis, whatever. The disasters itself are all man-made. The first earthquake I went to in Armenia killed tens of thousands of people. A year later, there was a stronger earthquake in Palo Alto in California. Only a handful of people were killed. That's not natural. That's architecture. And that's a function of wealth, and it's the poor that are most vulnerable to disaster. Poverty is a product of politics and economics, and it can be changed. And as Sir Michael Marmot says, the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it is justice. Disasters, as you are aware, are on the increase as we become more urbanized and due to climate change, but deaths from them have gone down remarkably. But all the deaths now are in poor people in poor countries. That is not justice. Just a quick one here. Fear of the unburied dead can be misplaced. Dead bodies are terribly distressing, and when you see them in the tens and the hundreds, they can be more distressing still. But they're not a threat to your physical health. Dead bodies alone do not cause epidemics. It's only if you've died from an infection that will live on after death, such as Ebola or cholera. Otherwise, distressing as they are no particular threat to you. Why am I so concerned about it? Because people who do get worried about dead bodies causing epidemics put them into mass graves. And I've stood next to relatives who, as the mass graves are being unearthed, watching them look out for any sign that they recognised a loved one. It's appalling and should be avoided at all costs. And finally, lesson 8, coming back a bit to the pandemic. Public health emergencies demand primarily public health rather than purely political responses. There's obviously a political element, but the public health element should take primacy. This, to me, is Manchester Central Railway Station, where, as a child, I used to get a steam train to Holyhead to get the boat to go and see my relatives in Ireland. Little did I know, 60 years later, it would become the Nightingale Hospital, and I would be asked to be its medical director. The Nightingale Hospital is a lecture in itself, but one of the things I learnt about decision-making in emergencies, which we could really apply much more broadly, is the Colin Powell rule. And it's why I think politicians get very nervous about making a mistake or being blamed. But if you look at it from those of us who work in emergencies, we know that we use Colin Powell's 40-70 rule. In an emergency, to do something quickly, you will need about 40% of the information you would like, ideally, before you act. Otherwise, it's a guess. But if you wait for 70% or more, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If somebody comes into A&E really sick, and you say, oh, we'll do an MRI scan, we'll do a CT scan, and all that, and these all take hours, well, you can ask the hearse to drop them off. It takes too long. You have to take chances and then work on the best information available to you, and then alter your choices as you get more information. So decision-making in emergencies has to be a balance between perfection and speed. And we need to move with great speed during pandemics and the like, and have no regrets. You will make decisions that need to be altered. They're not mistakes. They were the best decision at the time, but you mustn't stand on your pride. You must then be prepared to alter them. We will mobilize, if we're asked to go to an earthquake, we'll mobilize our team, which is great expense to us. We will go. Because if we wait too long to say, are we really need it? Are we sure they really want it? They've asked for us, we will go. If then they turn around and say, well, actually, it's not as bad as we thought it was, I'm very pleased for you, we will come back, there's no regrets. And some final thoughts. I know all the criticisms about aid. I've heard them all, and I accept them all. Even Florence Nightingale criticised the Red Cross when it was proposed, because she said if volunteers started treating the wounded on the battlefield, it would relieve the warring factions of their responsibilities and just allow them to kill more people. That's basically what she said. I understand the point. I don't agree. But what I take from all the criticisms of aid is not that we mustn't do it, but that we must do it better. It must be informed by science and evidence. One of the biggest critics of aid is the wonderful Mary B. Anderson, an economist. And even she acknowledges that it's a moral and logical fallacy to conclude that because aid can do harm, a decision not to give aid would do no harm. So finally, what have I learned in general? There's but a veneer of civilization. It cracks with remarkable ease, so be vigilant. There are more resilient people than vulnerable, so don't worry, at least not too much. The strong must look after the weak, and human beings know altruism. I have seen the most wonderful things. People say, oh, you see so many bad things. Yes, I do, but my overwhelming experience has been the goodness that people will do, that people will give of themselves and show altruism and put themselves in harm's way for people they don't know. When we set up the Nightingale Hospital, originally people signed up because COVID patients were going to come into us. They were going to bypass the NHS. Huge risk to people who volunteered. People came, we will do it, we will take the risk. During Ebola, we had to stop recruiting people because we had enough. Even when one of the nurses got Ebola, I rang up, we had other people in hospital who turned out not to have Ebola. I rang up a nurse who I knew was waiting for an Ebola test. All the other tests had proved negative. She was just waiting to see whether she had Ebola. I rang her up to try and give her comfort, but she ended up comforting me. She sensed the anxiety in my voice and said, look, she says, I know you recruited me, but she says, if the worst happens, I want you to know it was worth it. Finally, this work is not without risk. I've suffered a various number of things over the years, but I came nearest to death when I didn't go. I was asked by the UN to go to Mongolia to do a health assessment with a UN team. There'd been a very bad winter and there were a lot of medical needs. And I said, yes, I would go. At the last minute, they changed the date of the mission. And I said, well, actually, you booked me to go to Kenya to do a follow-on after the Nairobi bombing. So they said, that's no worry. We will get somebody else to go in your place, Gerard Leclerc. The helicopter crashed and he was killed. So I dedicate this lecture to his memory. UK Med continues to work in Ukraine. We went to Turkey. We're still there in Turkey, running primary care clinics to support the health service as well as running a surgical response. We're in Malawi, managing the cholera outbreak. Our work continues. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the university for all the support it's given me from being a medical student right through all my career. And I hope that we've lived up to its values of outstanding research and teaching and social responsibility. Thank you for listening, and Slava Ukraina.
Thank you, Tony. That was amazing. I was just reflecting that this afternoon I met with the editor of Nature, one of the two most prestigious scientific journals in the world. And he said, I know universities and vice-chancellors like to see their staff publish in the best journals, but do they really care about the impact of that research? I gave an answer. I think I've got a better one now. I'll give him the link to this lecture. So we do have time, and Tony's agreed to take a few questions, if people have. You can put your hand up and wait for the roving microphone. Anybody want to ask a question? Can we have the lights a little bit up? Can we just see a little bit better?
There's somebody at the back.
Somebody at the back. Can you put your hand up again? Sorry, I can't see. Oh, you've spotted. Oh, yes, just next to you. Yeah, no, back, no, back, one row, back, left, sorry, no, you were right, down, sorry.
It's like the golden shot.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Hello?
Yes. Go ahead.
Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Redmond, for a really enjoyable lecture. It was excellent. I just wanted to ask what you thought, what you think healthcare professionals can do to influence the government in prioritising health in its response to the climate and ecological emergencies, which are inevitably going to cause a lot more disasters to which your charity and others like it will have to respond in the future? Do you see a role for healthcare professionals?
I do. We have to advocate. When you say what will be the effect, we're feeling them now. This migration of people is largely climate change related. And one of the things I've always realized as a healthcare professional is your power of advocacy. Because in spite of everything people do tend to trust us, and it's why politicians are very wary of us, because people do listen to us. And I think we have to advocate for people to take climate change very seriously and incorporate it at every level of what we do.
Thank you. Other questions? You have to wave. Yes, right at the back. Right next to the microphone. That's handy.
Hi, Tony.
Hi.
Is this working? Yes.
Yes.
Hi, great lecture. Thank you very much. I'm getting to that stage in my career where you reflect backwards, and you've given us a lot of reflections today, but just wondered if there was one thing you could have done differently, what would that have been? And perhaps along the same vein, if you could say something to your younger self, what would that be?
Okay, that's fine. Just one thing I would have done differently. I still am troubled by responding to Armenia. I did it with the best of it. We were asked to go, and I did it with the best of intention. I'm already going into defence mode. But I should have, perhaps could have realised that what the scale of it was, and that we really were not as prepared as we should have been. And I seem to have spent my whole career thereafter making up for it. And so what I would have said to my younger self was, don't go if you're not properly prepared. A more general to my younger self would maybe slow down a bit.
And particularly your older self.
Thank you. I have rather rushed at everything, but having said that, I'm not so sure I would be me if I did it any differently.
Great. Got time for a couple more, I think. More? One over there. Yes. I think part way up and just on the right of the middle.
The response to a disaster is essentially one-dimensional, but a conflict is by definition at least bilateral, if not multilateral. You only respond to a request. Have you had requests from conflicts from both sides or from multiple sides? And if so, how do you resolve that conflict?
Yes, yes, we have. When we stick to the humanitarian principles, which require you to be neutral and impartial and put the care of people paramount, and we have to be independent. We stick to those principles. They can get very difficult in a conflict. But say in Sarajevo, for example, the Bosnians were being shelled in the middle by the Serbs on the outside. We did give aid to both sides, even though the needs were greater for those in Sarajevo who were actually being shelled by the Serbs from the outside. But we did give aid to both sides because both sides asked us. I tried to give more aid into Sarajevo because I thought they needed it more, and I ran into a lot of problems. I was accused of not adhering to the humanitarian principles, and I was arrested by the Serbs. But so it is difficult. At the moment, the Russians haven't asked us to provide aid. I mean, he has my number, but so far.
Any, right at the back again.
I'm not really clear at speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
just
How
hold it
much
close.
need is there for education in these war-torn disaster regions? Will that help the situation by training on doctors in their country? You know?
I think, can I just check, what opportunities are there for education in war-torn countries, particularly for the next generation of doctors, nurses?
Oh, we train nurses and doctors in Ukraine. I have to say, what is not quite appreciated by Ukraine, they have a very well-established, very good healthcare service. They have lots of surgeons, very highly skilled surgeons. What they asked of us is to give that additional specialist surgical input that they just don't have enough of, as most countries don't, because their demands are suddenly increased. But yes, just as we would here, when we carry out our work there, we train Ukrainian nurses and doctors alongside our people who are there in the same way that we do here.
We've got time for one more question, if we've got one more. One over here. Can you wait for the microphone?
Hello, Professor. Thanks very much for a wonderful lecture. You mentioned about the pandemic. I think as I was coming in today, I saw that there are 2 people that possibly got avian flu. You know, I mean, they do say that it's inevitable, another pandemic, and I wondered how much have we learnt from COVID? And you say about the balance between people like yourselves and politics and getting this right. Have we made any progress? Thank you.
Well, we hadn't learned enough by the time the pandemic occurred. I mean, that's clear, that's been acknowledged. We were too quick, I think, to move public health from its very local base, this has been over the last 10 years or so, into a more centralised Public Health England approach, now the UK Health Security Agency. Because remember, we have managed outbreaks before we had antibiotics and before we had vaccines. And we did it by test, trace, isolate and support. We've always done that because we know that if you identify cases quickly and you can isolate them, but they do need, these is individuals, they do need support, then you can slow down the spread. And I have a feeling we've lost some of that, what is called actually shoe leather public health, just local people going around identifying cases and supporting people, and gone for perhaps a more technical and centralised approach. And I think it is being appreciated that it's not an either or, we need to build up the local response. To answer your question directly, what have we learned? I don't know yet. The response is being reviewed. And again, it's why I emphasise a public health approach, not a political. We have to do this for the good of us all and try and remove, as tempting as it is, political blame to get out of this a level of preparation that will, it's inevitable that there will be another pandemic. You know, this unscheduled, yes, unexpected, no. And we have to prepare for it, and we can prepare better.
Thank you.
Generally speaking, the UN at the moment is talking about giving the WHO universal powers, global powers, basically, to organise a response globally to the next pandemic. How do you feel about that compared with the localism that responds to
well, you need
how
both.
things are on the ground?
You need both. WHO actually has powers, not so much powers, can influence, can interplay with countries when it moves from being an epidemic in one area to across countries to being a pandemic. It can do that already. Powers of WHO, I don't think it will ever have power because it functions by the agreement of all the member states who are part of WHO. So it has influence, it can give advice, but the power lies with the individual countries. And we need to, in this country, I think, and I feel that there is a chance we might do this. I'm trying to be a pathological optimist, that we can learn lessons and we can keep what we have centrally, but build up what we have locally.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Catherine Leopold, who is chair of our Alumni Association, to give the formal vote of thanks on behalf of our alumni, in behalf of you, to Tony. But I just want to finish by saying, on my behalf, thank you all for coming. Thank you for all the people who made this lecture happen. And thank you particularly, Tony. Thank you. Catherine.
As Nancy said, I'm Catherine Leopold, I'm chair of the Alumni Association, and it falls to me to say thank you, but given the breadth of the talk, it feels like an enormous thank you. I thank you also for your pathological optimism at the end, because in a talk of such disaster and such trouble, you've left me with tremendous hope. And I think when you talked about embodying the Manchester values, I think that's pretty much it nailed. Quite frankly. So thank you on behalf of the Alumni Association, thank you on behalf of all of you, and can we please do a huge thank you to you. Thank you. So you're all now most welcome to join us for a drinks reception downstairs. Thank you for your ongoing support.